Hello, I'm Marcia Franklin, and you're watching a Dialogue Web Extra, a continuation of my discussion with historian and author Douglas Brinkley. He's a professor at Rice University and the author or editor of, gosh, what, 24 books or so? A lot, a lot. But you also write magazine articles. You're a contributing editor to Vanity Fair, and you've interviewed some pretty cool or rad or however we wanted to, however we would describe them, individuals, including Bob Dylan, Norman Mailer, Ken Kesey, Hunter Thompson. First, what attracted you to doing interviews with these kind of popular culture?
Well, I find them, I try to do them on people I think are historical figures. I did the official, an article on Neil Armstrong and got to interview Neil Armstrong a lot. I did a book on Rosa Parks because I think 500 years from now, Neil Armstrong and Rosa Parks are sustainable American figures, that they're not just because they're alive now doesn't mean they're not important. So I think Hunter Thompson with his Fear and Loathing in Vegas book in particular is going to be read and read and read, almost like Great Gatsby fashion of capturing that 60s, 70s milieu. So I took Hunter seriously, and Kesey with One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and sometimes Great Notion, Norman Mailer with, you know, Armies of the Night and Naked and the Dead. These are major historical figures, and they became friends of mine.
How?
Well, Hunter, I'm the literary executor of Hunter's estate. When I first met Hunter with my magic bus, I brought students to Colorado, and we just got along very well. He wouldn't autograph my students' books, he would shoot them. He'd line up the books and fire them. Some of my kids had their hole through their, you know, and he was just a great American individualist, libertarian spirit living up there near Woody Creek, Colorado. We became great friends. I edited Hunter's letters, The Proud Highway, with him. Yeah. And we would sit up for hours and work together. I did The Proud Highway, then Fear and Loathing in America.
We've got book covers of those.
Yeah, and so that's how the Hunter one started, and we became I used to talk to Hunter virtually every day. We became that close with him. And people like Bob Dylan, you know, what a thrill for me. I grew up in Perrysburg, Ohio, working at a Holiday Inn, and on my breaks I'd crank out Bob Dylan. Songs like Mr. Tambourine Man and Don't Think Twice, were, you know, Desolation Row. Those are my favorite songs.
So how do you gain access to somebody like Dylan, who's
Well, because you build on it. I had written I'd written for Jan Wenner, the editor of Rolling Stone, a Kurt Vonnegut profile, and got a great response. I did a Mailer one. And Dylan didn't want to do any interviews, but one thing led to another, and my name got approached to him, and he knew me as a historian, and we got green lighted, and I flew over and spent time with him in Paris, and then spent a bunch of nights in Amsterdam. And just like you and I are talking, we would go into a suite, and he had the big doors open, and we were right over a canal, and a breeze was coming in, blowing the curtains, and he would bring out coffee, and both of us are coffee drinkers. Not wine or anything. We just drink pots of coffee and talk.
He would talk to you because he's notoriously
He is. It was very odd. I have to admit, I felt blessed. It was very unusual. I can't quite explain it.
What do you think the connection was?
I know what it was. He said it to me. He said, people say I'm difficult, but he goes, you're a historian. He goes, you know, it's a trade. You're a tradesman. Like people like electricians or a plumber, or you're doing your job. And I have something to say about history, you know. It was just, I got the feeling he didn't mind talking. It's just a lot of people come and ask him what he considered newsy. He called it newsy people, you know, that come in, or 40-year-olds that are writing about 20-year-old rock bands. And they would often be the ones, so he didn't want
hangers-on type people.
Yes, and so if you were going to treat it seriously, I also got a big thumbs up because I'm technically incompetent, and I had only a little portable thing, and he said, oh no, those are better. I just had like the little push the two buttons from Radio Shack.
He wasn't intimidated then.
Because he doesn't like his things going on the internet. And I said, well, he, you know, asked what's happening with these interviews. And I said, I'm bringing back to Austin, Texas. I live up on a hill by myself. I'm going to transcribe them, and your archive gets a copy of them, and I keep a copy. That's it. You know, your voice isn't going to be, you know, because he finds people are like, you know, it's like the Native Americans with a buffalo where you use every part of the carcass. Today you do an interview with somebody like Bob Dylan, and people just start taking from it and always wanting extra, and it's not a nice thing to do to people if you're looking to have a normal conversation. So
what was your objective in speaking with him about history?
Oh, it was fascinating to me. I could have gone on forever with them. I wanted to understand. I had a lot of questions that I developed over the years. So, for example, many people made a big deal with Dylan at the Newport Festival when he went electric. He told me that was nothing. For one thing, he had already played electric clubs in Chicago before that. But the big scary moment for him was the Ed Sullivan Show, because it was live on CBS, and he had practiced this John Birch Paranoid Blues song, and it had passed the censors all day long, and they rehearsed it, and he was almost ill. He was a kid, nervous, playing on live TV, and right before the show, they told him, "I'm sorry, Mr. Dylan, you're not going to be able to play that. Play Irish folk songs instead." And his mind got scrambled, and it was really a breakdown of nerves. And he had his family watching in Minnesota, where he was from, and he walked out of the back door, just abandoned the Sullivan Show, and it gets presented, he said, in history as my public protest. And he said, I just got scared. I couldn't think of an Irish folk song. I had rehearsed all of that. And then, you know, so just stories that he would be able to tell.
So it was mostly about clarifying his history as opposed to his take on American history.
Well, it was both, but he had said, you know, he's been, there's so many false stories about him.
Yeah, I've talked to Pete Seeger as well about, you know, the whole pulling the plug.
Yeah, people get a narrative in mind, and they insist that it's this way, and some of it's all true, but there's often usually nuances to it. And so, but just to talk to him about people like Woody Guthrie, and I talked to him about his, driving down to see Carl Sandburg in North Carolina, and you know, the influence of Kerouac and the Beats on him. And it was I treated it as a historic interview. And he was really a mensch. He's a very nice man and a wonderful guy.
When you write your books, and I have several at home for research for this interview, they're quite large. I think the Roosevelt book was, what did one reviewer call it? Thick as a sequoia. It's about 1,000 pages. When you write magazine articles, it's got to be condensed. Is that hard for you to?
Magazines are easy.
Switch your brain around, or
easy. Okay. There's nothing easier than.
Don't you worry about all the stuff you have to leave out, or?
No, okay. I mean, it's just the art form that's so simple to me, because the harder one is the long book. Look, I have a responsibility when I write on Roosevelt and conservation, or when I'm writing the whole history of Alaska wilderness in the quiet world. I've got to make sure I'm not leaving people out. And, you know, it's easy. My editor on the Wilderness Warrior said I could have easily cut it 300, but this was a time in our age to give some of these other people their dues. I had to use Theodore Roosevelt to talk about Frank Chapman, the great ornithologist who saved all these birds, or William Hornaday, who repopulated the buffalo of the...
Or Lacey,
Congressman Lacey of Iowa, the Lacey... And they're not going to get... If I cut them out of the narrative and just do TR because we're in a celebrity culture and he's a name, and stick to that, I'd be losing the story. And it becomes kind of false when you do the 400-page biography just on that person, when you're dealing with the movement. Because Roosevelt was the leader of the conservation movement. It's just like Martin Luther King was a leader of a civil rights movement, but you don't want to cut out all the other key people just to hit a 400 mark. So on some of my books I do that. I'll write the shorter ones, but for this conservation wilderness cycle, I'm doing it definitively. So when I'm dead, and 50 years from now, libraries will say, look, there it is. He took the time to be inclusive. It would be easy to write about the 70s environmentalism without Frank Church. But he deserves this place in there, and I have a responsibility to bring him into the main thrust narrative. If you're doing an article, a profile of somebody, I'm doing, you know, Kurt Vonnegut, it's just on Kurt, it's a little take. And then you could do this jazzier language. You could play with your language because you're dealing with the smaller space, so you can keep fixing it. And it actually, I've had a lot of people say, boy, we love your magazine profiles, but then the books are so long. And that usually comes from journalists, because the journalists think that it's so hard to do the shorter form, and the historians are doing a better work. The work of somebody doing a biography of Frank Church, which been done, that's, you know, this long detail, that's a lot of work.
Are you going to be including Frank Church then in your
Yes.
in your books
Yeah,
about
he's
conservation?
one of the most important figures. You know, he came into the Senate in the late 1950s, right when people were getting this environmental consciousness, and he was reluctant about environmentalism of the 60s and 70s to a degree, but he came along and was able to push through a series of wilderness bills. And of course, you have the, you know, a great wilderness site named after him here in Idaho, but the you know, so that's all. You know, you got to bring them in, and you go to other states, and in Idaho, everybody knows Frank Church. If I go right now and gave a speech in Florida and said the name Frank Church, it's blank. So you see, I want to get him in people's minds, get him in reviews, get people talking about some of these people, because they were warriors who went in and used our and saved all these great areas of America from ruin, and they deserve to get a kudos. And you've done a good job here in Idaho. You named a wilderness site after him. So, but many of these are by people like Lacey. There's no memorials to him, you know.
And the word warrior was intentional in your book, wasn't it?
Yes. Well, in TR's case in particular, because. And you know what he did. You know, we forget when you have federal park rangers and all, they're deputized and all that. You know, you just think of the ranger all in uniform. Do you ever think how odd that is that we have like militarized people to protect nature? But that's how many people wouldn't listen. It's the federal that would steal petrified wood, that would come in and poach elk.
They still do.
Yeah. And people don't respect it.
It's interesting because you call it wilderness warrior, and in those days, setting aside that land was considered wilderness. But nowadays, many of the national forests, they went through a cycle of being heavily logged, and they aren't considered wilderness anymore. In his era, they were, but today they would not be considered.
If you love America, if you're a patriot and you love this country, you got to respect the land, and you got to leave the land better than you found it. That does not mean you don't timber and you don't mine. Of course you do.
But they're not considered wilderness today. In his era, they would have been.
But the bottom message is just don't clear cut. I mean, it's grotesque to go to old growth redwood in California and say, oh, we might get a court injunction soon. Let's clear cut 2,000-year-old trees to sell to Japan for redwood saunas. And we're taking our heritage of our kids and just clearing off a mountain, or in West Virginia just blowing off mountaintops for real quick profit for one generation. That's not heroic. That's greed.
I wonder what President Roosevelt would have done about the BP spill. It would have been
he would have been down their throats. He would have taken Tony Hayward and shoved him into the hole. I mean, meaning he did not ever allow a corporation to pretend that they had power of the federal government. The United States government's the most powerful entity in the world. And for a corporation to have acted the way that BP did towards the United States, that's why Roosevelt broke up monopolies and trust. That's why he went after big timber. If you go to Alaska, all Roosevelt did in Alaska when he saved, for example, the Tongass and Chugach National Forest, is said, look, we don't want a New York JP Morgan bank coming in and destroying this area, and then they leave. And you got room. Why don't you build sustainable communities and create logging as a long-term enterprise with smaller pulp mills instead of big corporate ones? He was against the modern corporation controlling American life.
As we wrap up, Professor, I want to give a pitch for a book that I really enjoyed of yours. You edited it, called Witness to America. Kind of maybe in between a magazine article and a book. It's people's first-person narratives of dating all the way back, for many years. I loved this book. I loved just sitting and reading little snippets of people's narratives from a time, a girl who was a feminist at age 14 or something like this, and then famous people as well. I really like this book.
Well, thank you so much, and it's a nice way. It's it should be a larger project because it's really the best way to kind of let other real voices speak for themselves, and I try to do that in that project.
Yeah, I would encourage people to take a look at that and your other books, many books, and if you want to go to our website, you can learn more information about Professor Douglas Brinkley and his great works. This has been a Dialogue Web Extra. I'm Marcia Franklin. Thanks for tuning in.